Welcome back to The Real Story as we continue our Memorial Day show. We're continuing also the focus on military issues. And of course, I think most listeners know I am a West Point graduate, and they should also know that there's been a lot of controversy at West Point as well. Just recently in the New York Times, a civilian professor, Graham Parsons, wrote about his resignation as a military professor at West Point. Now, I'm not sure. I think he actually got fired or not actually rehired for the next semester. And that's because West Point's trying to tighten things up in the wake of President Trump's orders to get rid of wokeness, get rid of the racial discrimination that's been going on for decades, and so on. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because there's some people who believe that there's nothing wrong with West Point, that is just fine. But I want to refer to an article that I wrote, and I didn't publish this, by the way. I did send it to West Point, but I did not publish it myself. And I think it's important to bring it out. And this was in November of 2020. And I'll just read the opening part. I recently learned that USMA had mandatory instruction by Caroline Randall Williams for the entire freshman class as part of English 101. That's plebe English. Miss Williams reportedly discussed elements of her essay, You Want a Confederate Monument? My Body is a Confederate Monument, published in the New York Times earlier that year. The entirety of the essay can be summed up in this one statement. I'm a Black Southern woman, and of my immediate white male ancestors, all of them were rapists. My very existence is a relic of slavery and Jim Crow. According to her, the basis for this statement goes back 5 generations to her great-great-grandparents during a time when slavery existed in America. Now, I wrote, the relevance of Williams being a featured speaker on such a topic falls in line with the revelation a couple of months ago. USMA was teaching critical race theory in the 3rd-year leadership course. The wokeness at West Point is out of control. For young white male cadets, the message sent to them during Miss Williams' presentation was clear. Your ancestors, too, were rapists and white supremacists, and you should feel their shame and examine your own privilege. You know, that was in 2020, and not a lot changed until Trump got in office. And then, of course, people like Dr. Graham Parsons, professor of philosophy at the United States Military Academy, wrote, it turned out it was easy to undermine West Point. All it took was an executive order from President Trump and a memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth dictating what could and couldn't be taught in the military in its educational institution. He says, I'm resigning after this semester from my tenured position at West Point. After 13 years on the faculty, I cannot tolerate these changes, which prevent me from doing my job responsibly. I'm ashamed to be associated with the academy in its current form. This is what he wrote. And he's upset that 2 history courses, topics in gender, history, and race, ethnicity, and nation, and an English course, power and difference, are going to be deleted from the syllabus. So the guy's definitely woke himself. And this screed that he wrote, and the many costs to West Point's capitulation, the fact that cadets won't no longer be able to openly investigate critical issues like race and sexuality, or be exposed to unfamiliar perspectives that might expand their intellectual horizons. This is what he wrote in that New York Times screed. Well, in response to that, an anonymous Bye-Bye West Point article is written by Pyrene. Now, Pyrene is a pen name for anonymous cadet authors who wrote a column in The Pointer magazine, which was published between 1923 and 1996. So Pyrene, obviously former cadet, wrote a response, a very good response to Dr. Parsons' screed. And here to discuss that with me is also a former West Pointer, class of 1972, James Atticus Bowden. He's very familiar with Pyrene, the writer, and has been authorized to respond on Pyrene's behalf to the article that he wrote for Real Clear Defense. But about Mr. Bowden, he served for 20 years as an airborne ranger infantry officer in 5 divisions. He earned a master's degree from both Harvard and Columbia. Oh my gosh, to go along with that West Point degree. He taught as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at USMA and adjunct faculty at the College of William and Mary, was a defense contractor with a specialty in Army futures. He created the tactical operations concept, The Quality of First, and he's a writer. In fact, he wrote a nonfiction piece called A Grief Felt, as well as over 1,000 pieces since 9/11. He joins me now on The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. Jim, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the MacArthur Society of West Point graduates. I'm speaking on behalf of Pyrene because we know the other side uses Zelensky's rules for radicals, and they would rather attack the author than the message. So when Pyrene writes, he is writing on behalf of the society. So anything I write, I know, Jeannie, you and I, when we write something in our name, we're willing to stand by it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you went a little bit deeper because, of course, Graham Parsons didn't actually articulate any of his real positions when he wrote to the New York Times, just simply put out these blanket statements that West Point's going to hell in a handbasket under Trump's policy with no more free thought allowed. That is not true. In fact, Pyrene said Parsons wrote about a Department of Defense policy change because it bans transgender persons from living as their preferred gender while in uniform. And he was upset about that. He was upset about the fact that there's a gender neutral standard as well. And he called it brutal cisgender hegemony. What is this type of person? Why are they teaching at West Point to begin with?
Well, his rebuttal says as much or more than his published works. Because in his rebuttal, he says, I stand by what I wrote. But gee, I don't like the fact that you're criticizing me, and I don't like the terms you're using. And one of the terms used, which is the point of the question you just asked, is cultural Marxism. And they really hate that term. They hate cultural Marxism. They hate being called leftist. They hate being called commies. They hate that nomenclature. But here's the deal. If you can bear with me for one quick background story. A number of years ago, I read a great book by Vodi Balcom Jr. called Fault Lines. And in it, he shredded DEI and critical race theory from a biblical viewpoint. So I read it as a masterpiece work. So I looked at the back at his sources. And then I went on Amazon and I bought 18 books. I read all that stuff. I am now the most woke guy. I live in Virginia. I'm the most woke guy in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I can tell you to park your privilege in a heartbeat. And in fact, I'm getting a little bit triggered right now by some of the things you're saying. So the fun part about that is when you go to the original documentation that they use, including a couple of people that he cited, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, as two authors, scholars that he called them, that ought to be referred to all the time. So when you go and read their stuff, go to the forewords. And in the forewords, they will thank this work is based on the work. They'll talk about the Hegelian dialect, Marx, then they'll talk about the Frankfurt School. They'll thank Marcuse. They'll thank Habermas. They'll thank Lukács. They'll thank all these Marxists for the genius of their thoughts, which led them to where they are today. So that's a long way of saying they hate being called cultural Marxists. They are cultural Marxists.
Well, what else have you found in your research looking at West Point? What else have you found from Mr. Parsons or others about what they've been teaching at West Point and how that's concerning?
Well, two answers to that. The quick one is back in 2021, I'm class of 72, at a mini reunion, our class president told us that the superintendent had told him that there's no CRT. Well, at that time, you could dig into a thing called the Green Book, which is the breakdown of the classes and the courses that are offered at West Point. It's not online anymore. But you could go down and look at the hour-by-hour instruction, and you could see the classes that they were teaching, the references that they were teaching. And I put together a memo that showed by naming courses and specific authors that they're citing that they were, in fact, teaching DEI and CRT. When you went to school and when I went to school, they were teaching rational empiricism. Now, they never said, oh, we're teaching rational empiricism. Rational empiricism was embedded in every science course and all the humanities. It's a way of teaching. Likewise, DEI and CRT, the assumptions that they're permanent classes of victims and oppressors, that there's a permanent hierarchy of oppressors and oppressed. That is being taught, and it's being inculcated in other things, other activities they have. The other point is, in terms of what they found, or what we found, simply by looking at his writings. Let me go to the first point.
Yes.
The first point is the most important. Professor Parsons said, I'm quoting, I and others have argued that military leaders may be ethically obligated to refuse and resist some extraordinary orders, even if those orders are legal. And then he says, there are times when, for the sake of civil society and the political neutrality of the state, the military should be insubordinate to civilian authority.
What?
Take a deep breath.
Those are both treasonous statements.
It is. I'm sorry. Forgive me for laughing, and I know you're gonna have to edit all the laughing out. But you're teaching cadets to disobey legal orders? On what planet? Where is that vaguely possible? I mean, How is that possible that you should be teaching the future officers of the United States Army to disobey legal orders?
No.
So,
I mean, in fact, in military law, we were specifically instructed about which orders would be legal or illegal and how to go up the chain of command if you thought that there was an illegal order. The whole military structure depends on the lowest soldier to obey legal orders in battle.
yeah, it's incomprehensible. I was going to school during the time of the My Lai massacre and the outcome and the disgrace that happened afterwards, the shameful things. And what was beaten into our brains, both as cadets and then as junior officers, was exactly what you said, the legality and the ethics, that you are required to not obey an illegal order. But there are very definite definitions of what an illegal order is. And you are required, though, to obey all legal orders. In fact, enlisted men in their oath swear to follow the legal orders of those appointed above them. So is this guy teaching that they don't have that obligation either? It is insane. I'm trying to find kinder, gentler words.
No, there's no other. It's just wrong that he was there. You had a couple more points too to make about the things that he was teaching. That is just
mind-boggling. I'm putting words in your mouth.
Go ahead, Jim.
It's mind-boggling. And then let me say something. We could laugh about this. Seriously, we could have a good time laughing about it, except for the fact that it's actually being taught at West Point. And he was there 13 years. How many cadets did he influence? Okay, so the first one was the most important one. You have a professor at the United States Military Academy teaching cadets that as officers, they have the right, or it's ethical for them, to disobey legal orders. That is a grand mal faux pas. That is a terrible thing to teach at the United States Military Academy. Then we go on to, and this is why it gets fun. He thinks that in the field of military ethics, that it would be improved if they look at the new literature, which is coming from the feminist approach to the ethics of war. Pray tell, what is the feminist approach to the ethics of war? I know there's first wave, because I remember I read all those books. I read 18 of them. So I know there's first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. What is the feminist approach to the ethics of war? Help me out here. And how does that improve the ability for cadets to be junior officers and then grow through their ranks and lead our country to fight and win our wars? I'm asking a question here.
Yeah, no, I don't know. But when I was a cadet there, we tried to downplay the fact that we were women at West Point. We just tried to blend in as much as possible. So I have no idea what he's talking about. I didn't know that there was a feminist construct to war, by the way. Had no idea.
I have no idea. And I can say, when I taught there 81 to 84, and I taught female cadets, and they were outstanding. And they were not outstanding because they were female. They're outstanding because they were outstanding. And some of the smartest cadets I taught, and some of those who were most dedicated at that time as cadets to looking ahead and serving in the Army were females. So that's a gem. And then the other one, this is along the same lines. He said that there's a problem in the history of military ethics, going all the way back to St. Augustine and theory of just war. There's a problem with these military ethicists because they wrote assuming gender binary theory. That I know you're starting to laugh. Okay, so somehow because they assumed the world was male and female when they wrote on the topic of military ethics, it either made them wrong or it left the field incomplete. It made something lacking. It just, they needed help.
Well, that goes along with his statement that Pyrene put in his Bye Bye West Point article that says, and this is what Parsons apparently wrote, I'm reminded of the tragic connection between masculinity and war. Masculinity enables the permissiveness of killing in war and is a primary motivation for atrocities. For this reason, humanitarians should make the study of masculinity an urgent priority. So are we supposed to emasculate men who are going to war? Is that the answer?
Well, he makes an interesting connection here. He actually makes the point that all of history assumed that the masculine nature was to be warlike and the female nature was to be nurturing. And he says All of history assumed that correctly. But then he says it's a problem. And it's a problem because, get ready for this, it establishes the supposed equal right to kill combatants in war. So I know you're hesitating there. Let me say it carefully. Apparently, you don't have an equal right to shoot at the people who are shooting at you because it is a supposed equal right to shoot back.
You're still listening to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives, and I have a former West Pointer on here, retired Army officer, Jim Bowden. And he just told us about this Dr. Graham Parsons, the guy who resigned as a professor at West Point because he was upset with the Trump Hegseth doctrine coming in. He had actually said that he thought it was a problem that you could shoot back at the enemy in war. Jim, how does he even get hired? Is nobody looking into his writings and what he's spewing to cadets?
I have no idea. But that is the question that needs to be asked, and a number of other questions need to be asked. Mm-hmm. His writing firmly establishes what his viewpoint is. And we've already characterized it, but I want to characterize it one more time. His writing is that of cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism is an insidious cancer, cultural Marxism. And as much as they dislike anyone saying that, it is Marxism. And Marxism is fundamentally wrong. Its premises are wrong, its conclusions are wrong, and every time it's been practiced, horrible things happen. Marxism is antithetical to what we have in the U.S. Constitution. It is antithetical to the American way of life. It is antithetical to everything that West Point stands for. So, having said that, the question arises, why is Marxism being taught at West Point, and why are cultural Marxists at West Point? And I don't have an answer to that question. When I taught 81 to 84, when I wrote something, I submitted it to my boss. I don't know how far up the chain it went in the department, but I was not going to submit anything for publication without prior approval. I don't know if that exists or doesn't exist today. Regardless, who hired him? What did he say in his interview? I don't even know what his academic credentials are because he's been scrubbed from the West Point faculty list that's on their website. Who gave him reviews? Who enabled this guy to stay there for 13 years?
Well, he stayed there too during the duration of both my son's time, who was a graduate from 2016, and my second son's time, who just graduated last year in 2024. Now, to my knowledge, neither one of them had Dr. Parsons as their professor, but they certainly had their father and I as their parents, and they weren't going to buy into any of that nonsense. Okay, Jim, there's a whole lot more to discuss because it's not just Dr. Parsons who's the problem. There's been other problems at West Point. The MacArthur Society has come up with what they call the Duty Honor Country Commission. Jim, could you talk a little bit about the Duty Honor Country Commission and why it is so necessary for West Point and the other service academies to adopt this type of review of what's going on at these academies?
Well, let me give a little bit of background. So, there was a Borman Commission after the cheating scandal at West Point. And the Borman Commission, which was set up by the Secretary of the Army, had 7 questions. They answered the questions. And then they said there's a problem at West Point with the culture of command. And they made a number of recommendations. What we believe at the MacArthur Society of West Point graduates, and what we share in beliefs with the Calvert Task Group and the organization called STARS, which is primarily Air Force Academy graduates, it has other members too, is that we don't know the depth of the problems at all 3 service academies. There's plenty of smoke in terms of the courses that are being taught. The piece that you wrote in 2020, based on the anti-racist piece that was written by the recent graduates, and other indications of the cheating scandal that they had at West Point fairly recently, the drug overdoses on spring break. We don't know the depth of the problem. We don't know how many other Professor Parsons are teaching. We don't know what other things, in addition to what Professor Parsons is teaching, are being taught.
Jim, let me just interrupt you there. We also know that the Counterterrorism Center actually had as a senior fellow Mike Morrell, who was the author and the instigator at Anthony Blinken's request to contact 51 former Obama intelligence folks and get them to sign on to that letter saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was disinformation. I mean, that's also something that West Point needs to answer for, and they have not.
The proposal that we put together, and it's, as I said, it's the West Point, MacArthur Society West Point graduates, Calvert Test Group, and STARS for all 3 service academies. is that we propose that the Secretary of Defense establish a blue ribbon commission to do a deep dive and look at all three service academies along 11 lines of inquiry. And they range from race-based admissions to issues about the honor code and how effective the honor code is, in fact, to the questions about changes in the NCAA rules on paying athletes, to the questions of the faculty and who's teaching there and what are they teaching. Our proposal is that they do a deep dive and then come back with recommendations, because what's happening today, good things are happening in terms of the Secretary of Defense's efforts to get rid of the DEI. But what they're really doing is they're mowing the grass. There are problems below the level of the grass. There are problems that are deeper, that it's going to take a deep dive to get down and investigate them and find them. Additionally, we are not presumptuous enough to believe that we know all the answers. We're not telling the academy and senior officers and officials what to do. We're not telling them anything. We're saying we can see problems. And frankly, let me put it this way. We believe we're asking the right questions. We are not presuming to dictate answers to anybody, but we do believe we're asking the right questions. And those questions, which are hard questions that need to be backed up with hard data, can be exercised by having a blue ribbon panel and a commission to do that study.
No, there's nothing wrong with going ahead. And, I mean, like you said, the Borman Commission did the same thing. What was that, almost 50 years ago?
Yep. It was in
now,
the 70s.
And there's nothing wrong with going ahead and taking a deep dive. I mean, West Point is the premier military leadership institution in the world. We train not just U.S. leaders, but also foreign allies. So there's nothing wrong with doing this dive. And I think personally that it is necessary and needed. This is not going to correct on its own. And I want answers to who hired people like Parsons and who taught these West Point graduates who wrote a 40-page letter, policy proposal, on anti-racist West Point. And they charged that there was systemic racism. And yet they were among the most privileged cadets to come out of West Point. So, I mean, we do need a deep dive into what's happened there.
Let me add one thing about the idea of a commission, and we'll see whether or not it's going to transpire, because ultimately the decision would be made at the Secretary of Defense level. He may decide what they're doing is satisfactory, or he may want to do the commission, or he may want to do something on his own. All I'm saying is we're making a proposal. The proposal is nonpartisan. It's only partisan if you think cultural Marxism belongs to one political party or another, and if you're in favor of cultural Marxism. And if you think opponents of cultural Marxism are only belong to one party or not. It is nonpartisan. It's absolutely nonpartisan, because the primary question the commission would be looking at is, what are the needs of the services for the next 50 to 70 years? If you go back, Douglas MacArthur came out of World War I, and his experiences in World War I were far different from his experiences when he was in the Frontier Army and the Colonial Army out there fighting in the Philippines. He knew that leading citizen soldiers in a conscripted army was different than leading the hardcore, in many cases, derelicts and adventurers, young men who were in the Frontier Army that we had after following the Civil War and up to World War I. We are at the same inflection point in time now. And what are the needs of all three services? What kind of majors do they need? What kind of coursework do they need? What needs to be taught to cadets? What do they need to learn in order to serve the country for the next 50 to 70 years? MacArthur's reforms in the 1920s lasted for over 70 years. So it's time to take that kind of deep dive. As I said, I'll say it a third time, it's nonpartisan. It is about the needs of the services, and it requires a very senior panel of some very quality people to go take a deep dive and take a look at it. One last thing, an example of something that might be wrong. When you and I went to school, we had a mandatory course in history of the military art. There were 2 semesters. So how many semesters of the history of the military art are they teaching nowadays?
1.
Mm-hmm. What's wrong with that picture?
It's terrible.
What is wrong? Yeah. Even 2 semesters,
it's not
can be
enough.
argued, is insufficient. Right. There's no self-correcting mechanism in any of the 3 institutions, the Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, Military Academy, that will fix that. because everyone who's there is invested in saying what they're doing because it's their job, it's their day job, is great. Many things, as you know from witnessing the experiences of your sons, is great. You have really great young people coming in. You have really great instruction in many areas, especially, I believe, in the hard sciences. It is in the areas of indoctrination that we're raising questions, and it's in those areas of indoctrination which reflect what's going on in this country. I'm an old poli-sci P. We are in a culture war. We're not taking sides in the culture war. We're saying West Point should be teaching the traditional values that it's based on, that duty on our country doesn't have a party label. And that's what they should be teaching.
The whole focus is to teach leaders of integrity that can fight and win America's wars in the future. That is the mission of West Point. And that's what they need to focus on. They're not. Okay, that's all we have time for. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. Jeanne Bowden, former West Point professor, West Pointer himself, on the discussion of reform is needed at the military academies. How are we going to get there? Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me on The Real Story.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.